They believed their armor could defy bullets, that the thin steel of the Type 95 Ha-Gos was more than enough to protect them. In the humid darkness before dawn on Saipan, diesel engines rumbled to life, echoing across the island like the heartbeat of an empire still convinced of its strength. For years, these Japanese light tanks had dominated battlefields, from the plains of China to the jungles of Malaya. They were fast, reliable, and unstoppable. Or so their crews thought. But the Pacific had changed. Beyond the palm trees and coral ridges waited Marines armed not with new secret weapons, but with a machine gun, designed decades earlier, the Browning M250 calories. When its armor-piercing rounds met the Ha-Gos' fragile plates, faith shattered faster than steel. What began as a confident counterattack would become a revelation written in tracer fire. How does a nation built on courage confront the moment when courage is not enough? How do men who trusted their machines face the truth that those machines can no longer save them? The story of the Saipan tank battle is not only about tanks and guns, it is about belief meeting reality and the cost when history outpaces design. In the early 1930 seconds, Japan's military planners faced a dilemma that would shape the nation's armored doctrine for a decade. The Type 89 medium tank, once a symbol of progress, had become slow and cumbersome. It could barely reach 15 miles per hour, a pace fit for infantry on foot, not for the fast-moving, mechanized army Japan dreamed of creating. The Imperial Army needed something lighter, faster, and easier to produce. A weapon that could race alongside motorized infantry across the vast spaces of Manchuria and the crumbling cities of China. In July 1933, the Army Technical Bureau issued a bold specification: a tank of about 7 tons, armed with a 37mm gun, capable of 40 kilometers per hour, and armored only enough to resist rifle and machine gun fire. The philosophy was simple: speed over protection, mobility over endurance. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract, and engineer Tomio Hara, already respected for his work on the Type 89, took command of the project. Hara's design would define Japanese armored engineering for a generation. His innovation, the bell crank suspension, soon nicknamed the Manchurian suspension, allowed remarkable cross-country agility. Combined with a lightweight diesel engine producing 120 horsepower, the Type 95 Ha-Gos could traverse mud and rough terrain at 25 to 30 kilometers per hour. For an era when most tanks still relied on gasoline engines prone to fire, this diesel-powered Japanese light tank was seen as a triumph of practicality and foresight. By June 1934, the first prototype rolled across proving grounds in Japan and Manchuria. Observers watched as the small vehicle darted between obstacles, its tracks gripping dirt roads and rocky hillsides. It turned sharply, almost gracefully, for a tracked machine. It was fast 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads and reliable. The tank could run for 10 hours on a single load of diesel, covering nearly 130 miles. The Japanese officers present saw not just a new vehicle, but a new doctrine taking shape. In 1935, after spirited debate, the Army accepted Hara's design. Infantry officers complained that the 12 millimeters of armor were too thin for close support operations, but the cavalry champions of speed argued that mobility was armor in itself. In the end, the cavalry won. The tank was officially adopted as the Type 95 Ha-Gos, its name drawn from the imperial calendar year 2595. Production began in 1936 at Mitsubishi's factories. Measuring just over 14 feet long and weighing around 7.5 tons, the Ha-Gos was compact, even fragile-looking by Western standards. Inside, space was suffocating. The 3-man crew, a driver, a machine gunner, and a commander worked in near silence, surrounded by steel barely thicker than a coin. The commander bore an impossible load, aiming, loading, firing, and commanding all at once, often without a radio. Only 1 in 4 tanks had one. The rest relied on flags and hand signals, primitive tools for the chaos of combat. Yet for all its flaws, the Type 95 Ha-Gos excelled in the wars Japan actually fought. In China, beginning in 1937, the tank seemed unstoppable. Against infantry armed mostly with rifles and light anti-tank weapons, it was a monster. Its 37mm gun could shatter bunkers, while its twin machine guns, one in the hull, one in the turret, tore through enemy lines. Crews became veterans in a war that rarely challenged their armor. Victories came easily. Each success reinforced a dangerous illusion: that Japan's tanks were not only good enough, but superior. That illusion survived even the crucible of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where the Japanese light tank met the Soviet Union's BT 5 seconds and BT 7 seconds machines faster, thicker-skinned, and armed with 45mm guns. The battle was brutal. Japanese crews fought bravely but discovered, often too late, that their shells bounced off Soviet armor. Their own vehicles, when hit, erupted in flames. Dozens of Ha-Gos tanks were destroyed. The lesson was clear: thin armor and light guns were death sentences in tank-to-tank combat. But lessons in war are only useful if they are heeded. The Imperial Army's response was not redesign, but rationalization. They blamed tactics, not technology. They believed that with better training, coordination, and surprise, their light tanks could still prevail. They viewed Khalkhin Gol not as a warning, but as an anomaly. When Japan turned south in 1941, invading Malaya and the Philippines, those same tanks found new life in terrain that suited them perfectly. The Type 95 Ha-Gos crossed rivers, crept through rubber plantations, and ambushed British positions where no one believed tanks could move. In the Philippines, they fought the first American tanks in the Pacific M3 Stuarts at Demortis on the 22nd of December 1941. At close range, the combat was savage and intimate. Both sides had 37mm guns, but the Japanese tanks' speed and the element of surprise gave them early victories. By the spring of 1942, the Ha-Gos had become a symbol of Japanese triumph. Crews believed in it, commanders trusted it, and the army enshrined it as proof that Japan's approach to armored warfare was sound. But beneath the glory was a fatal flaw. Every success came against enemies who lacked proper armor or anti-tank weapons. Japan's armored corps had never truly been tested against an equal foe. War, however, has a way of demanding payment for arrogance. The Pacific war armor race was accelerating. The United States was producing tanks by the thousands, their designs evolving with each campaign. The Japanese Type 95 Ha-Gos, born from the needs of the 1,930 was about to meet the industrial power of the 1,940 seconds. The men who trusted it were about to learn what happens when courage meets calculus, when belief collides with metallurgy, and when the future arrives faster than anyone expects. The night air over Saipan was heavy with heat and tension. Diesel engines rumbled like distant thunder as 44 tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment formed up in the darkness. Colonel Takashi Goto stood beside his Type 97 Chiha, its 57mm gun glinting faintly under the moonlight. Around him, the lighter Type 95 Ha-Gos tanks idled restlessly, their exhaust pipes coughing smoke that hung low over the sugarcane fields. For the Japanese, this counterattack was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a desperate statement of faith. If they could drive the Americans back into the sea, the Empire might yet hold its ground. The order came shortly after 3 a.m. Engines roared, tracks clattered, and the line of Japanese light tanks began to move toward the American beachhead. Infantry clung to the hulls, gripping turret handles as the column crept forward. The ground trembled under the synchronized rhythm of steel tracks. Inside each cramped tank, the crews were drenched in sweat, their nerves drawn tight. Most had fought before China, the Philippines, Malaya, but none had faced the storm that awaited them on Saipan. Across the field, Marines of the 2nd Division were awake and listening. Sentries heard the rumble first, then the metallic squeal of treads on volcanic soil. Officers barked orders. Machine gun teams swung their heavy Browning M2. 50 calories weapons into position, tracing the sound through the pre-dawn gloom. In foxholes and behind sandbagged emplacements, men waited, fingers resting on triggers. At 3:30 a.m., the first shadows emerged low, boxy silhouettes moving through the mist. "Tanks!" someone shouted. The Marines opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked across the darkness like burning comets, slamming into the advancing armor. The rhythmic thunder of the Browning M2. 50 calories filled the air, deep and steady, echoing across the field. For the Japanese crews, the first impacts sounded familiar metallic clangs against the hull, the expected percussion of small arms fire. But within seconds, that sound changed. The clangs became cracks, and sparks flared inside the compartments. Bullets weren't ricocheting, they were penetrating. The armor of the Type 95 Ha-Gos, 12mm at best, was no match for the 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. At 200 meters, those rounds could pierce nearly twice that thickness. Inside one Ha-Gos, a driver screamed as a bullet tore through the vision slit, striking his shoulder. Another round punched through the side armor, cutting through ammunition boxes. The small interior became a furnace of ricocheting fragments and screams. The commander, trying to rotate the turret manually, felt the crank freeze in his hands as a slug smashed through the gear housing. He never saw the second bullet that killed him. From his defensive position near the airfield, a Marine machine gunner named Corporal James Harkins fired in long bursts, walking his tracers across the lead tanks. He watched as one Ha-Gos slowed, then stopped. Flames rose from the rear deck, the diesel engine coughing smoke. The tank's hatch opened, and two men climbed out, only to be cut down by rifle fire. Another Marine, Private Alan Morris, aimed his half-track mounted 50 calories at a tank's flank. The bullets punched through cleanly, and through his scope, he saw a spark inside, then silence. The turret sagged forward, motionless. By now, the field was chaos. The Japanese formation, still advancing, found itself under intersecting streams of heavy fire. Marines fired from concealed emplacements, Shermans rumbled forward from behind the lines, and the air filled with explosions. The M4 Sherman tanks, weighing over 30 tons, dwarfed the Ha-Gos both in size and in power. Their 75mm guns opened fire, each shot detonating with concussive force. A Sherman crew spotted a Ha-Gos attempting to flank the line. The gunner adjusted, fired once, and the Japanese tank erupted, its turret blown clear. The difference between the two machines was night and day. Where the Ha-Gos had thin plates riveted to a fragile frame, the M4 Sherman boasted angled armor up to 51mm thick, effectively resisting all Japanese 37mm fire. Still, the Japanese charged. One Ha-Gos, its tracks already damaged, continued to crawl forward, its commander standing half exposed from the turret. He waved his sword and shouted orders to the infantry following behind. Moments later, a burst from a Browning M2, 50 calories, cut him down. His tank coasted a few more meters, then caught fire. Within an hour, the counterattack collapsed. Of the 44 Japanese tanks committed, 31 were destroyed on the field. Others burned through the morning, their ammunition cooking off in dull explosions. The remaining vehicles withdrew, leaving behind a landscape littered with twisted steel and shattered belief. As dawn broke, Marines walked among the wrecks. They examined the neat round holes punched through the armor entry and exit points from the 50 caliber rounds. One officer remarked that he could push his fist through the openings. The thin steel had offered no resistance. Inside, the scenes were horrific. Burned interiors, ruptured ammunition racks, the smell of diesel and death. For the Marines, the revelation was twofold. First, they had discovered that the Japanese light tank was far weaker than intelligence reports suggested. Second, they realized their own standard infantry weapons were enough to stop it. The Browning M2, 50 calories, originally built for anti-aircraft use, had proven devastating against the Type 95 Ha-Gos. It was an accident of design. A weapon never meant for tank warfare had rendered an entire class of enemy armor obsolete overnight. For the Japanese survivors, the realization was unbearable. One officer later captured told interrogators he thought the Americans must have developed a new secret gun. He could not believe that an ordinary machine gun could destroy a tank. His disbelief captured the essence of Japan's armored tragedy, a faith in spirit and ingenuity, shattered by the cold logic of industrial warfare. When the smoke cleared, Saipan belonged to the Americans. The Saipan tank battle had ended in disaster for the Empire, but its echoes would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The Marines had learned that Japanese armor could be defeated by firepower already in their hands. The Japanese had learned that no amount of courage could stop a bullet that simple physics said would go through. It was not just a tactical defeat. It was a moment when two worlds collided, the world of handcrafted courage and the world of mechanized efficiency. And in that collision, one truth stood unbroken. In modern war, design matters more than devotion. By the morning of the 17th of June, 1944, the beaches of Saipan were quiet again. But the silence was not peace. It was exhaustion. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, carrying the acrid scent of burning oil and steel. Marines moved cautiously among the wreckage, rifles ready. The bodies of Japanese tankers lay beside their ruined machines, some still clutching their sidearms, others frozen in positions that spoke of desperate final acts, trying to reload, trying to escape, trying to believe the armor around them still meant safety. 31 tanks were confirmed destroyed in the immediate battle area, though later counts would raise the number higher. The Type 95 Ha-Gos lay in twisted heaps, their thin armor punctured again and again by the heavy slugs of the Browning M2, 50 calories. Each impact hole told a story, a burst of light, a moment of shock, and the instant collapse of all illusions about invincibility. For the Marines, victory came with grim respect. Many had faced Japanese tanks before on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, where the Japanese light tank had seemed dangerous. Now, walking among the wrecks, they saw them for what they were, artifacts of an earlier war. One Marine captain gathered his men around a destroyed Ha-Gos and pointed to the holes in its turret. "This is what you were fighting," he said. "Remember it. Don't underestimate your weapons again." The Saipan tank battle marked the end of the Ha-Gos myth. News of the defeat spread quickly across the Pacific. On Tinian, a month later, 7 Type 95 tanks launched a counterattack and were destroyed within hours. At Peleliu, the tanks were dug into caves, turned into stationary pillboxes because mobility had become suicide. On Iwo Jima, Colonel Takeichi Nishi buried his tanks up to the turrets in volcanic ash, hoping the earth itself could serve as armor. It did not. Flamethrower Shermans and bazooka teams burned them out one by one. By 1945, the Pacific War armor balance was beyond redemption. At Okinawa, the Japanese 27th Tank Regiment fielded only 27 operational tanks, 13 Ha-Gos, and 14 Chi-Ha mediums. The Americans brought over 800 tanks ashore. The counterattack of May 4 and 5 lasted only hours. M4 Shermans rolled through the Japanese lines, their 75mm guns reducing Ha-Gos to molten wreckage. Bazooka teams and 37mm anti-tank guns picked off stragglers. The battle wasn't a contest, it was execution by physics. The emotional toll on surviving Japanese tankers was immense. Prisoners captured after Saipan and Okinawa spoke with disbelief. One officer said he felt betrayed by steel. He had trusted his tank like a second body, only to learn that it offered no more protection than paper. Many expressed shame not for losing, but for being sent into battle with machines already obsolete. They spoke of courage wasted, of training undone by neglect, of loyalty that met only silence from those who sent them. These testimonies were collected by American intelligence officers and later analyzed at command level. What they revealed went beyond tactics. It exposed a systemic flaw. Japan's armored forces had been built for colonial warfare, not industrial conflict. The Japanese tank doctrine emphasized mobility, surprise, and the moral superiority of the crew. It never evolved to match the material realities of modern war. After Saipan, American forces adjusted quickly. Manuals began to include instructions for engaging Japanese light tanks with .50 caliber fire. Units were trained to aim for side armor, engine decks, and turret seams. What had once required specialized anti-tank teams could now be handled by any infantry platoon with heavy machine guns. Confidence grew, and with it, a sense of inevitability. In Tokyo, the shock was political as much as military. The loss of Saipan put American B-29 bombers within range of the home islands. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned in July 1944, a symbolic acknowledgement that the war's tide had turned. Yet even as Japanese engineers proposed new designs, the Type 3 Chinu, with a 75mm gun, the Type 4 Chito, with thicker armor industrial collapse, made mass production impossible. Between 1936 and 1943, Japan had built about 2,300 Type 95 Ha-Gos. In the same period, the United States produced more than 40,000 M4 Shermans. The ratio was more than 20-1, but numbers alone didn't tell the full story. Each Sherman was faster, stronger, and easier to maintain. It was a product of a nation that could afford to learn, adapt, and replace. After the war, several captured Ha-Gos tanks were shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. American engineers studied them with the same curiosity scientists might give to fossils. They measured the armor 12mm at its thickest, 6 at its thinnest. They examined the cramped interior. 50 cubic feet for the commander, no seat, no powered traverse, no ventilation. They noted that only 1 in 4 tanks carried a radio. The rest relied on flags or visual signals methods that failed the moment smoke filled the battlefield. The verdict was clinical but damning. The Type 95 Ha-Gos was an excellent vehicle for a war Japan had already outgrown. It was built for an enemy who could not shoot back. Its light frame, once praised for mobility, now condemned its crews to death. Against the M4 Sherman with its stabilized 75mm gun, 51mm of sloped frontal armor, and full radio network, the Ha-Gos was an antique For the Japanese soldiers who had believed in it, the realization came too late. They had fought bravely, but bravery cannot thicken armor. They had trusted in speed, but speed cannot stop a bullet. When the Browning M2, 50 calories slashed through their hulls, it was more than metal. Giving way, it was faith collapsing under the weight of modernity. As the war drew to its close, the pattern repeated: Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Manchuria. Every battle confirmed the same truth. The Japanese light tank was obsolete. The empire had entered the industrial age of war with pre-industrial illusions. When the Soviets invaded Manchuria in August 1945, Japanese tank units faced T-34 seconds whose 76mm guns made even the Sherman seem modest. At Shumshu Island in the Kuril chain, 77 Japanese tanks defended against Soviet amphibious landings. Within 2 hours, 21 were destroyed. It was the last stand of Japan's armored corps, and it ended as predictably as all the rest. For historians, the Saipan tank battle marks the symbolic death of Japan's armored confidence. It was not only the moment when bullets pierced steel, but when industrial reality pierced national mythology. And yet, in that defeat lies a paradoxical dignity. The crews of the Ha-Gos fought not because they believed they could win, but because duty demanded they try. Their courage was real. Their machines were not. The war had taught the world a brutal equation. Courage multiplies strength, but it cannot replace it. In the end, the Type 95 Ha-Gos became a relic, one that spoke of ingenuity constrained by poverty, of faith betrayed by arithmetic, and of the tragedy that occurs when valor meets the modern machine. For the United States, the Saipan tank battle was not just a tactical success. It was a revelation about how modern war would be won. When Marine officers sent their reports to headquarters, the conclusions were clear and startling. Japanese tanks could be defeated with weapons already standard in every company. The Browning M2, 50 calories, long considered a support weapon, had proven itself an anti-tank tool in the Pacific. The discovery changed doctrine almost overnight. Training manuals were rewritten. Marines learned to aim for the sides and engine compartments of Japanese light tanks. Infantry units practiced coordinated fire drills that concentrated multiple 50-caliber guns on moving armor. The fear that had once accompanied the cry of tanks disappeared. Soldiers who had seen the Type 95 Ha-Gos burn knew it was vulnerable, even fragile. They no longer waited for artillery or Shermans to deal with armored threats. They handled them themselves. But beyond tactics, Saipan carried a larger lesson, one of industry and economy. American officers studying captured equipment recognized that Japan's defeat on the battlefield began in its factories. The Type 95 Ha-Gos was not a failure of courage. It was the product of an industrial system that could not keep pace with modern warfare. In contrast, the M4 Sherman was more than a tank, it was a statement of capability. Built by Chrysler at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, by Fisher Body in Michigan, and by Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, it embodied the full weight of American manufacturing. In December 1942 alone, Chrysler produced 97 Shermans in a single month. That was more than Japan built of Ha-Gos in an entire year. The Detroit Tank Arsenal itself became a symbol of what the historian Richard Overy later called industrialized courage. Spread over 500 acres in Warren, Michigan, it operated day and night under a forest of cranes and assembly lines. Thousands of workers, men and women, veterans and newcomers built tanks with the same rhythm that once produced automobiles. Rosie the Riveters welded armor plates and fitted turrets, transforming a civilian workforce into the backbone of a mechanized army. By 1945, over 49,000 M4 Shermans had been produced. They were not perfect, they were not invincible. Against German Panthers and Tigers, they struggled. But they were good enough, reliable, maintainable, and available in overwhelming numbers. In the Pacific, where their heaviest opponent was the Japanese light tank, the Sherman was unstoppable. The contrast could not have been sharper. One nation building hundreds of tanks per month, another struggling to deliver dozens per year. The implications extended far beyond Saipan. The ability to produce and deliver war machines faster than they could be destroyed became the defining characteristic of Allied victory. Logistics, not just bravery, won battles. For every tank Japan lost, it might replace one. For every Sherman destroyed, America replaced 10. The factories of Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh were as decisive as the divisions in the field. Globally, military observers took notice. British and Soviet officers analyzing the Pacific War armor recognized the same principle that had already defined the European front. Industrial power was strategy. Japan's defeat in armored warfare was not an isolated failure, it was a symptom of systemic imbalance. When Hideki Tojo resigned after the loss of Saipan, it was more than political fallout. It was the realization that Japan could no longer compete in a war of production. The American public, reading about the victory, saw it differently. Newspapers described the island tank battle in heroic tones, Marines standing firm against armored assault, machine gunners cutting down steel monsters with unflinching resolve. Few readers understood the deeper meaning, that these monsters were relics, their weakness proof of a larger truth about modernity. In Washington, strategists began to apply lessons from Saipan to future operations. If the Type 95 Ha-Gos was obsolete, then Japan's entire defensive network, based on similar hardware, would crumble under sustained pressure. This realization informed the planning for Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. It also reinforced confidence in America's industrial strategy. General George C. Marshall summarized it simply: "The arsenal is our greatest weapon." Yet, even as Americans celebrated, some military thinkers approached the victory with sobriety. They recognized that the destruction of the Japanese light tank symbolized not just superiority, but a moral weight. To annihilate an opponent so thoroughly, to turn courage into futility, was to glimpse the darker side of technological dominance. War had become mathematics, velocity, penetration, output. Humanity was still present, but overshadowed by calculation. Around the world, nations watched and learned. The Soviet Union, already mastering its own industrial mobilization, saw confirmation of its approach: mass production over artistry, quantity over elegance. In Europe, British engineers accelerated the transition to the Centurion, a tank built on lessons from both German and Japanese designs: sloped armor, stabilized guns, radio coordination. Even post-war France and Italy began to see armored warfare not as a contest of heroism, but of engineering. For Japan, the lesson was bitter. After 1945, its surviving officers wrote reports analyzing why their armored forces had failed. They cited not morale or tactics, but resources. "We had good men," one officer wrote, "but our factories were too small for modern war." In post-war years, Japanese engineers studying American and Soviet designs would carry that memory into the peaceful industries that followed. The precision and discipline, once devoted to tanks, would later build cars and machines for commerce rather than war. The Saipan tank battle thus transcended its moment. It was the physical embodiment of a shift that defined the 20th century, the replacement of warrior ethos with industrial efficiency. When the Browning M2, 50 calories, tore through the Type 95 Ha-Gos, it wasn't just steel meeting steel. It was a nation powered by assembly lines, confronting a nation still bound by tradition. For the United States, the triumph at Saipan confirmed a doctrine that would shape the rest of the war. Victory belonged to those who could outbuild, outship, and outlast their enemies. Every bullet, every tank, every gallon of fuel became part of an arithmetic that Japan could no longer solve. The Marine who squeezed the trigger of his 50 calories did more than stop a tank. He demonstrated that the future of warfare belonged to production as much as to bravery. And for the world, watching from afar, the message was undeniable. The industrial age had fully conquered the battlefield, the era when valor alone could decide victory was over. The new weapon was not courage, it was capacity. The morning sun over Saipan rose through a haze of smoke and salt air, revealing a battlefield littered with silence. Steel husks shimmered under the heat, once proud symbols of imperial strength, now reduced to rusting monuments of failure. The Type 95 Ha-Gos tanks lay scattered like relics of another age, small, brittle, and heartbreakingly human. Around them, Marines moved in quiet efficiency, their victory already part of the machinery of a war that would grind on for another year. Yet for those who paused to look, the sight carried a deeper meaning. The story of the Japanese light tank was more than the tale of a flawed machine. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of faith in isolation, a reminder that courage and innovation cannot thrive without resources to sustain them. When the Browning M2, 50 calories, tore through 12 millimeters of armor on that June night, it did more than pierce steel, it pierced the illusion that willpower could replace industry. The Saipan tank battle endures because it captures the exact moment when one world ended and another began. It was the collision of two philosophies, one that valued spirit above material and another that recognized the cold necessity of production. The men in the Ha-Go tanks believed they carried the spirit of their nation with them into battle. The Marines who faced them carried the factories of Detroit, the forges of Pittsburgh, and the relentless logic of assembly lines. When those worlds met, history was decided not by who fought harder, but by who had prepared longer. In that sense, the battlefield of Saipan was not simply a military engagement, it was a referendum on modernity. The Type 95 Ha-Go, designed in the optimism of the 1930 seconds, embodied a Japan still defining itself through courage and sacrifice. The M4 Sherman, forged in the crucible of total war, represented an America that had learned to turn economic power into strategic advantage. Each tank told its nation's story. Each bullet wrote the verdict. The aftermath of Saipan echoed far beyond the Pacific. The fall of the Marianas placed Tokyo within reach of B-29 bombers, leading to the air raids that would devastate the Japanese homeland. The resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, once unthinkable, signaled that even Japan's leaders understood the scale of the disaster. For the men who survived the Ha-Go's final stand, the realization was cruel but clarifying. They had fought bravely, but bravery had become a finite resource in a war governed by machines. After the surrender, American engineers studying the Type 95 Ha-Go at Aberdeen noted its craftsmanship, simple, practical, even elegant in its purpose. It was not incompetence that doomed it, but context. The tank was perfectly suited for a different war. The campaigns of China, the jungles of Malaya, the Philippines in 1941. It was never meant to face M4 Shermans and 50 caliber fire on islands, turned into fortresses. Like a soldier trained for yesterday's battle, it was overtaken by time. The legacy of the Ha-Go, therefore, lies not in its failures, but in what it teaches. It reminds strategists that every weapon is a reflection of its era, that doctrine without adaptation becomes dogma, and that technology, once ignored, will eventually dictate the terms of courage. The Japanese tank crews at Saipan fought with conviction. Their defeat was not of spirit, but of circumstance. They were brave men, trapped in fragile machines. For the United States, the victory carried its own lesson. Industrial power is a double-edged sword. It can win wars, but it can also distance soldiers from the very struggle their machines make possible. The Marine behind the Browning M2. 50 calories may not have known the name of the man inside the tank he destroyed, yet their encounter was intimate in its finality. A meeting of two human beings separated by 12 millimeters of steel and a century of technological change. In museums today, the Type 95 Ha-Go stands beside the M4 Sherman, their metal preserved and polished. Visitors see them as artifacts of an age of extremes, but each carries a different silence. The Sherman speaks of triumph, mass production, and confidence in progress. The Ha-Go whispers of valor outpaced by invention, of men who fought bravely within the limits of their nation's reach. Together, they tell the truth that every era of warfare must learn anew. Power is not just built, it is maintained, renewed, and paid for in factories long before the first shot is fired. As historians reflect on the Pacific War armor, the image that endures is simple yet profound. A 50 caliber round cutting cleanly through a Ha-Go's hull, light bursting from within like the brief flare of a dying star. In that instant, the age of industrial warfare declared itself supreme. It was not heroism that decided the battle. It was production, precision, and inevitability. And yet, even in defeat, the story retains a human core. The Japanese tank crews who climbed into their Ha-Gos that morning believed they were protecting their homeland. The Marines who destroyed them believed they were bringing that same war to an end. Both were right in their own way. Between them lay the truth of the 20th century, that technology changes faster than courage, and that every generation must learn what happens when bravery faces the machinery of progress. The fields of Saipan have long since grown quiet. Grass covers the rusting wrecks, and the sea whispers where the battle once roared. But the lesson remains etched in steel, in numbers, in memory. In modern war, as in life, belief is powerful, but reality is absolute.